Well, Grace Community Church, we are thrilled to have Professor Doctor Anna Lembke with us today. Professor Lembke, thank you so much for joining Grace Community Church. I had written to you earlier that we're a church for people who don't go to church, and we just really appreciate you coming. The book that you wrote is fantastic, and I think the best compliment I can possibly pay you is you have helped me understand the Bible better. And
wow, I'm honored.
Thank you so much for that. It is really a gift. So we appreciate you being here. Tell us, why did you become a doctor?
I became a doctor to help people. It's not really very complicated for me. It was just I wanted to be useful and to be needed and to add some small positive value, and that is what drove that decision.
That's wonderful. That's very Christ-like of you. So that's awesome.
Well, I don't meet that bill. Trust me, I'm far, far below that. But you know, it wasn't complicated, is what I'm saying. There wasn't like a deep backstory.
That's great. You've written this book, Dopamine Nation, that I have read, and now I've reread it, and I'm on my third reading of it at this time. So it's really great. Tell us, why is dopamine so important?
Dopamine is the molecule in our brain which is fundamental to the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation. It's probably even more important for motivation than it is for actual pleasure. So, for example, there's a very famous experiment in which rats were engineered to lack dopamine in the brain. And what the scientists discovered is if they put food in the rat's mouth, the rat would eat the food, even seem to get pleasure from the food. But if they put that food a single body length away, the rat would starve to death because it wasn't motivated to shuffle over to get the food. So dopamine has this very fundamental role in reinforcement, reward, motivation to do the work to go and get the thing we want.
Fascinating. So we really do need dopamine in our lives. Just we need it in a certain way?
Yeah, so dopamine is key to get us to do the things that we need to do to survive. It's a way to signal to us the valence or value of a given experience in our lives. So it's a really important sort of pay attention kind of a signal.
So you write about this. I'm going to put it in my own words, but this pleasure and pain balance, and this is the way it hit my brain, is why does too much pleasure lead to too much pain? What's up with that?
So too much pleasure leads to too much pain because pain and pleasure work like opposite sides of a balance in our brain. So imagine that in this particular part of our brains called the reward pathway, there's a balance like a kid's teeter-totter, right? When we experience pleasure, it tips one way. When we experience pain, it tips the opposite. But there are certain rules governing this balance, and the overarching rule is that the balance wants to remain level. And with any deviation from neutrality, our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance. And our brains do that by first tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus was. So let's say we do something pleasurable, we release dopamine in the brain's reward pathway, the balance tips to pleasure. The way our brain brings it level again is first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain and then going level. That has very important implications. It means for every pleasure, we pay a price, and that price is the come down, the after effect, the hangover. Now, it might be very short lasting, right? It might be even outside of conscious awareness, but it's like that moment you eat a piece of chocolate, you get pleasure. And then there's that moment where you want another piece of chocolate, right? So that's essentially the fundamental sort of machinery behind how we process pleasure and pain. Now, in terms of how that progresses to kind of a more pain or addiction, you want me to talk about that?
Sure, yes.
Okay. All right. So the second rule governing this balance is that with repeated exposure to the same or similar rewarding stimulus, that initial response to pleasure gets weaker and shorter, but that after response gets stronger and longer. And one way to think about that is to imagine there are these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again, but they like it on the balance. So they stay on until it's tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain, and then they get off, and then we're level. But if we continue to bombard our reward pathway repeatedly with highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, we end up with more and more gremlins on the pain side of the balance. And ultimately, we're then in a dopamine deficit state where those gremlins are enough to fill this whole room and they are camped out there. We've changed our hedonic set point. Now we need pleasure not to feel good, but just to level the balance and feel normal. And when we're not using, we're walking around with the balance tilted to the side of pain, experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and intrusive thoughts of wanting to use, otherwise known as craving. So that was a really long answer that you probably would like me to reduce down. Shall I do that?
Yes.
It was okay.
No, that was great. Just two quick follow-up questions.
Yeah.
Because I've been running around telling everybody, oh my gosh, what was written in Ecclesiastes 3,000 years ago, this overindulgence and everything ended up meaningless and pleasure and pain, blah, blah, blah. Some people immediately get it. And other people are like, well, I don't understand. What do you mean by pleasure and pain? And how does that, can you talk a little bit about what characterizes pleasure? Because not everybody understands, oh, okay, when I drink alcohol, that's what, when I do video games. So can you talk a little bit about pleasure and pain, just real briefly, what constitutes?
Broadly.
Yes.
Yeah. So when I talk about pleasure in this context, I'm talking about the thing that we do or we ingest that instantly makes us feel good. And that feeling good can take many guises. It can be, I'm out of my head and out of my body, and I don't have to think about myself. I'm immersed in this activity where I lose a sense of time. I'm subjectively euphoric or relaxed or sleepy. So it can take many different qualitative types of, guises. But the bottom line is it's a very quick way to alter my mental status so that I essentially don't have to be present or be uncomfortable, and I can feel better. Whereas pain is that thing that I do where I'm really hoping this is going to end soon, right? And that can also take many different guises. It can be actual physical pain where it's like, ouch, this hurts, I want it to stop. But it can be effortful engagement in a difficult task where, the longer I do it, the more exhausted I get because it's effortful. That's also a form of pain.
Yeah. And you had said in the book that if you're experiencing, you want to experience pleasure, push on the pain side.
Right.
You talked about the guy in the ice bath, which I thought that was fantastic. I've started experimenting with cold water now because of it.
Oh, great. That's great. Yeah. So essentially these gremlins that I talked about, they're agnostic to whatever the initial stimulus is. So if we initially press on the pleasure side by using an intoxicant or playing a video game or shopping or eating sugar, those gremlins will hop on the pain side, tip us to that side of pain, and then ultimately, level the balance. Again, unless we repeatedly do it and end up with a bunch of gremlins camped out. But if we first pass actually tip our balance to the side of tip our balance to the side of pain, those gremlins will happily hop on the pleasure side and eventually readjust our set point to the side of pleasure, which is why I really recommend that we intentionally do things that are hard. And this can be physical things like exercise or ice cold water baths or martial arts or other types of effortful mind-body work, but it can also be cognitive things or emotional things where we're effortfully engaging in that task. And what we have found, lots and lots of studies show that this type of painful or effortful engagement actually signals to the body to start to upregulate dopamine levels. So for example, what we see with exercise is gradually while exercising, not initially, but at some point into it, dopamine levels slowly start to rise and then remain elevated for hours afterwards before going back down to baseline. Same thing with ice cold water. Whereas intoxicants or digital drugs, what we see is a sudden spike in dopamine. Then we have dopamine free fall, not just to baseline, but below baseline. That's the dopamine deficit state. And then we go back to a level baseline.
It's absolutely fascinating. This is the thought that was in my head. A number of weeks ago, I did a message on anxiety and why is it that the wealthiest countries in the world are the most anxious countries in the world. And then I was reading your book, and you have said it so well that we have so much available to us to bring us so much pleasure that it's just causing that. And the picture I had in my mind is, in an affluent country like America, we can just keep hitting the pleasure button. And when we feel pain, we can just hit it harder and harder and harder.
That's right.
And here's the thought that came to mind. Our brains won't allow us to find the pleasure that we truly seek and that wholeness and that meaningfulness in life if we just keep hammering away on that pleasure button.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. What's so important for people to realize is that this is very physiologic, right? It is instinctive for us to approach pleasure and avoid pain. We do not need to think about it. We are hardwired to do that. And that is fundamentally adaptive in a world of scarcity. It's what has allowed us to survive and thrive for millions and millions of years. But now we've reached a turning point in terms of technology, the Anthropocene, which is a way of describing how humans have changed the planet, such that we are living in this world of incredible overabundance, such that there's this mismatch between our ancient wiring and our modern ecosystem. And this mismatch is the source of a lot of our misery, because our brains weren't evolved to constantly get what we want the instant we want it in an overwhelming and highly potent form, right? We were evolved to be strivers. We were evolved to desire. Desire is innate. It's part of being human. We wouldn't be human without desire. But we were evolved to desire and then have to work very hard for a very long period of time to get what we want. We don't have to do that anymore. Even children now, like, what do you give a child on their birthday, right? They have everything. They get everything, right? There's not even any kind of like, oh, I'm going to wait for that doll in the window. Or it's like, no, Amazon delivered it yesterday. So, and this is just, one example of the world that we live in now. And the problem, again, as you said very well, is that this fire hose of dopamine, essentially, our brain responds to that by just going, look, let's shut down our own dopamine factories. Like, just shut them down, because we got way too much going. And then when we're not distracting ourselves with these pleasures, we're in dopamine deficit, which is really akin to depression, anxiety, insomnia.
We are in a series on this letter in the New Testament called Colossians. And in it, Paul says you should put to death, and then he has this list of things. And then basically says you should clothe yourself, and then he has this list of things. Here's my idea. I want to get your thought on this, okay?
Okay, yeah.
The list of things that he said we should put to death in our life is sexual immorality, rage, anger, malice, bitterness, all these things, right? Here's my thought, doctor. Mm-hmm. Those are all instant gratification, pleasure things. Right?
They are.
So it's, I'm going to get it in the moment. Like, I really let that guy have it, and I just lost it. But the other list, love, compassion, forgiveness, they're a combination of pleasure and pain. Yeah. Because love can feel good, but it also hurts. Yes. And sometimes the love and the hurt are right there together.
Yeah, right.
There's so much wisdom there. Like, when you're hitting the love button and the forgiveness button, you're hitting almost simultaneously pleasure and pain in some ways.
Yes, right. It's a wonderful analogy. So the way I think about this is to really think about time as a construct. In general, when we can do something that immediately makes us feel better, that is a thing that's going to get us in trouble down the road. It's not always true, but it's often true because that's a thing, especially in the world that we live in today where everything has become drugified. That's a thing that will potentially release a lot of dopamine instantly. And I love how you brought in anger there because it's not just like, pleasing things. Dopamine's actually really responsive to danger signals, and people can be rageaholics, right? So it's that thing that just is that release of dopamine in the reward pathway. But we always pay a price for that. And it's a physiological price. I think that's what I really want to convey to people. Of course, the Bible talks about the morality of all of this, and that's essential. And of course, through the lens of religion, that's how we understand what we are now understanding through neuroscience. They're converging and coming together. But there's a real physiologic price because with any deviation, that severe deviation from neutrality, you're going to pay a physiologic price. What's much better is the kind of suffering that we surrender to and trust that that kind of suffering will lead us to greater rewards in the end. So, and that's true. I mean, that's true, right? The Bible teaches that, every major religion. And now neuroscience is teaching that too, that basically mild to moderate noxious stimuli, that's good for us. It's a signal to the body to upregulate all of our feel-good neurotransmitters and hormones, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, our endocannabinoid system, our endo-opioid system. So it's so interesting to me how like neuroscience is converging with this age-old wisdom and kind of translating it and corroborating it in a new way.
Yeah, it is. Okay, here's the second question. Is abstinence important?
Abstinence is really important to resetting dopamine reward pathways. I would love to tell you that there's an easier way to do it, but there really isn't. Also, people always ask me, well, can't I just cut back a little? And I say the problem with cutting back is that you won't reset dopamine reward pathways. You really need to abstain from your drug of choice long enough for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance and for neutrality or homeostasis to be restored, which is another way of saying for your dopamine firing levels to return to their baseline levels, at which point you can then take joy in more modest rewards and see with more clarity the true cause and effect of your drug use, which is really hard to do when we're chasing dopamine. Whereas if you just modestly cut back, you won't do that. You'll still be in that dopamine deficit state. Now, once you've reset reward pathways by abstaining for long enough, and typically it takes about 30 days to reset dopamine firing, then you can decide whether or not you want to go back to using that drug in moderation. And you'll be in a clearer sensorium to be able to do that and much more likely to be successful. Whereas if you don't abstain and you just cut back, much harder to do that.
Mm-hmm. You had included in your book Prohibition, and we often talk about Prohibition like it was just a terrible failure. But there were some good things that came out of it, like the fact that we didn't have alcohol so readily at our hands. I think you put in that alcoholism went down significantly during that time. Is that right?
Yeah, so this is one of these little understood facts about Prohibition. All we hear about is the speakeasies, the black market. But what people don't appreciate is in that decade in which the sale, importation, and consumption of alcohol was illegal, rates of alcohol-related liver disease decreased by half, rates of public drunkenness decreased by half, and those rates remained lower for decades after the 20s, into the 30s, 40s, and even 50s. It's really only in about the last 3 to 4 decades that we've seen a huge spike again in alcoholism, especially among women and especially among young people. And why is that? Because of increased access. Access to drugs is one of the most important risk factors for addiction. If you have easy access, you're more likely to try that drug and more likely to get addicted to that drug.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Thank you for that. Community. Is community vital to success in overcoming our addictions?
I think addiction can be conceptualized as the antithesis of community. What happens as we become addicted is that we replace relationships with other people with our drug of choice. There are even some people who say we replace our relationship with God with our drug of choice, and that drug becomes a kind of a false worship. I think what's essential to appreciate is that we can get addicted even when we have the perfect community. So we can have the best partner and the best parents and the best kids and the best church, and we can still get addicted because the drugs themselves are addicting and can hijack our reward pathway and then cause us to isolate from all of the wonderful people in our lives. So community and connection is really the opposite of addiction. That means that once we're addicted, in order to come out of that place, we have to turn toward community and make those intimate and healing connections. And I really want to emphasize intimate and healing connections because there are lots of ways we can connect with people today that is basically just another form of a drug.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're exactly right. Healthy connections.
Right.
Yeah, so vital to success. What role does radical honesty play in success with addictions?
Right. So we often talk about the importance of having deep and healing and intimate human connections, but we don't necessarily talk so much about how to get them. And I propose radical honesty as a way to foster intimacy. What is radical honesty? It's telling the truth about everything, large and small. So not just telling the truth about our drug use, whatever it may be, but also about why we were late for the meeting, how much we spent on an item of clothing, whatever it is. It turns out that the average adult tells 1 to 2 lies per day. So we're natural liars. And that in order to tell the truth, we actually have to work at it. We almost have to have like a little watcher in our brain sort of monitoring as we go along. But I've learned from my patients in recovery that telling the truth about everything is a really good practice for managing addiction, preventing relapse, and also fostering intimacy. Why is that? Because telling the truth about the things that we're ashamed of sharing, we think it's going to chase people away, but actually it makes people come closer and love us more because of the experience of shared humanity and our shared brokenness. It's also true that when we're telling the truth, we're telling true stories about ourselves. And the stories that we tell about our lives are fundamental, not just for organizing past experience, but also for creating healthy roadmaps for the future. And if we're telling stories that aren't true, for example, always blaming other people and never acknowledging how we've contributed to a problem, then we're not telling truthful narratives. And without truthful narratives, we won't know how to act going forward. And then, interestingly, there's a lot of neuroscience now coming out suggesting that truth-telling may, in fact, stimulate the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is that gray matter area right behind our foreheads that's so important for delayed gratification, future planning, and storytelling. And we know that when the prefrontal cortex is talking with the limbic brain or the pleasure-pain pathway, then we've got a much better chance of being able to manage our consumption. It's when there's a disconnect between those two things that our gremlins and that pleasure-pain balance start to run away. So telling the truth may be a very good way to stimulate the prefrontal cortex, to strengthen it. We know whatever parts of our brain we use more often get stronger. And in strengthening that part of our brain, help us manage this problem of compulsive overconsumption, which is so pervasive in the world today.
Mm-hmm. We often say around grace that the quality of your relationships determine the quality of your life. And we say that because of the study that was done by Harvard, about that long study they did. I can't remember the professor's name right now at the moment that they released. They've been doing it for like 75 years. And such, that is such an impact that, how do we tell our future? It's more than our cholesterol, our bank account. It's really the quality of our relationships that determine where we're going, in our life. I loved the fact that you gave that window into the marshmallow experiment. What did those kids do? The ones that actually, we know they were more successful because of delayed gratification, but what did they do? They turned away.
Yeah.
Sometimes they,
Yes.
did their hands or they
Right.
petted the marshmallow.
Right.
That was
Right.
excellent.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was really interesting because this marshmallow experiment, most people are familiar with it. It's this idea that if you put a kid in a room with nothing but a table and a chair and a plate and one marshmallow, and you tell that kid, hey, if you can, I'm going to leave the room, but if you can wait 15 minutes and not eat that marshmallow, when I come back, I'll give you a second marshmallow. So you'll have two marshmallows. And what they did was they tracked which kids could do that. And there's kids about between the age of 3 and 6, I think. One very clear indicator was that the older the child was, the more likely they would be able to wait. So delaying gratification is a developmental phenomenon. But there were also real differences just temperamentally. And they found that the kids who were able to delay gratification also showed other evidence of, other types of mature and adaptive function later in life. But as you talk about, one of the things that's not so much discussed, but which I found fascinating is what the kids do in those 15 minutes, right? And they engage in what I call self-binding. So these are the types of strategies we can use to try to exert our willpower to resist temptation. And they did a variety of things. Like some of the kids would turn away and not look at it, right? So get it out of our sight, which is a very good strategy. Get it out of the house, right? Another kid kicked the table, or kicked the chair or whatever. So that's interesting. It's a form of actually using pain as a sort of distraction. But the most interesting child of all actually began to pet the marshmallow. So in a way, she made that thing sacred, right? So she kind of paradoxed herself and made it sacred. The other fascinating sort of wrinkle on that marshmallow experiment is they did a version where in half the kids, they said, if you ring this bell before the 15 minutes are up, we'll come back. And they they split them up into two groups. And in half of them, when the kids rang the bell, the adults went back. And the other half, it was actually a lie. And when the kids rang the bell, they didn't go back. And what they found, not surprisingly, is for the kids, who were lied to, where they didn't go back when they rang the bell, those kids were much more likely to eat the marshmallow before the 15 minutes were up. They weren't able to wait. Whereas the kids who were told the truth were much more likely to be able to wait the full 15 minutes and not eat the marshmallow. And I think that's really important because it speaks to the sort of contagious quality of truth-telling and the ways in which when kids are raised in an environment where they don't feel like they can rely on people to do what they said they were going to do, those kids get into survival mode, right? They start working out of limbic brain or dopamine brain, and they're just going to get what they can when they can because they can't rely on the people, around them to provide a kind of stable container for their future development.
When there's not truth, when there's not certainty, it really causes some big problems. And you just mentioned self-binding. I love the fact that you brought in Odysseus, right? Who gets tied to the mast of the ship. Yeah.
Right.
That's really, really good.
Yeah. So self-binding is this idea that before we're in a state of desire, we can anticipate that state of desire and create barriers, both literal and metacognitive, between ourselves and our drug of choice. Because once we're in the throes of desire, it's almost impossible to resist because of the fluctuations in dopamine that will drive us to want to, restore homeostasis. So the legend of Odysseus is that he knew, or he had heard, that this particular strait, if he went through, he would hear the call of the sirens, and that would lure the ship to the rocky shores, and they would all perish. So what he did was he had all of his sailors put beeswax in their ears so they couldn't hear the siren song. And he had his sailors then lash him to the mast of a ship before they entered that strait so that although he could hear it, he wouldn't be able to do anything about it. And that's just a great literal example of self-binding. And my patients have taught me all kinds of great self-binding tricks. My patients will tell me, well, when I travel, I call the hotel in advance and I tell them to remove the minibar, right? That way it's not there to tempt me. Or I have a patient, who got addicted to video games. He has one laptop for schoolwork and another laptop for video games, and he doesn't mix the two. And that way, when he's doing his schoolwork, he's less tempted to play video games. So all kinds of little tricks like that.
Yeah. That's good. here's the next question, and I think you'll have to help us understand it. What are the pros of prosocial shame? Because when we think about shame, that's not always a positive, like that word is like shame. Whoa. But what are the pros to this prosocial shame that you write about?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that shame has an important prosocial function, which is to say, shame is the emotion we experience when we deviate from group norms or group expectations. It's a very powerful emotion, and it's one that people will work hard to avoid, right? And again, our avoidance of that shame is what motivates us to do the things that our community has said it values. And without that, things would be chaos, right? So I think it's really important to acknowledge that shame has a prosocial function and a highly adaptive function. The problem is that when people deviate from whatever the social norm or expectation is, and they experience shame, if there's no path to walk to make amends, if people are just shunned from that community, then shame is no longer prosocial because there's no way to make up for having transgressed, so to speak. But this is happening all the time, in the modern world, including in churches where people are not going to tell the truth because they know that if they were to do that, they would essentially be shunned by that community, or there would be no way to kind of make it up. So this is, I think, an important thing when we're thinking about building healthy and healing communities. How can we make a space for people to admit wrongdoing, to experience shame, which is the source of motivation, to avoid that wrongdoing going forward, and not feel like they have to hide or lie or risk being shunned? That's really, really key, because I do believe that religion, is born of the acknowledgement of our brokenness and our need for each other to heal together, and a place where we can come and be beloved despite being broken. But when communities become a place where we have to hide our brokenness and pretend that everything's great and we're perfect, then those are no longer healing communities, because then people will hide, their problems, and they will hide their addictions and all of that. There are so many spaces now in the modern world where people have to show up to impress, right?
Yeah.
And there are so few spaces where people can just show up and be like, I'm feeling really messed up, or I did really mess up, or I'm thinking about messing up, or whatever version that is. But people are so hungry for that, and yet there are so few outlets for that. Whether it's in schools or religious organizations or professional organizations. Like for me personally, I don't generally like to go to professional doctors' meetings because it's a lot of grandstanding. People, I did this great thing. One of the reasons I was really drawn to the world of, addiction medicine doctors is because a lot of docs in recovery work in addiction medicine. And you'd go to these meetings, people, I'm an alcoholic, right? This was my life before and it was like so refreshing. I was like, I can't believe these doctors in this professional setting with other doctors are, comfortable talking about that. And that's really informed, that informed my book, where I was open about some of my own compulsive overconsumption. It really informs my teaching of fellows and residents. I learned so much more from my mistakes practicing medicine than I ever did from my successes. So I share those mistakes. And it works on a number of different levels. It works because, you just learn a lot from mistakes, right? But it also works like, hey, like this doctor who's a full professor here at Stanford, she had some serious mess ups, right? I guess my mess ups, I don't have to hide them either.
That's wonderful. We started this series by talking about, the title of the message was Our Universal Addiction. And we're all universally addicted to it. You put whatever name you want to it. The Bible puts a number of names: pride, sin, sarx, That Greek word would basically means I'm curved in upon myself. And that, until we get to the place where we can name that 100% of us, we're locked in on that. It's going to be really hard to become everything that God created us to be. We want to be, life needs us to be, all of those things. So,
yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think to just repeatedly and communally acknowledge how frail we are and how flawed we are and how it's a daily struggle. I think this is just so important.
Yeah. Paul, who writes this book of Colossians that we're studying, is famous for saying he's the chief of all sinners. And this is the guy that theologians call the greatest Christian who ever lived. And he's like, I'm also the greatest sinner who has ever lived.
Yeah.
We've talked about some really important things, and you have given us so much wisdom and insight in science. We've talked about the fact that community is really important, and maybe the path towards being in good community is a path towards where we want to go. And then when we allow addictions, idols, however you want to call it, it's taking you to a place of isolation. So here's kind of the last question I have. That so many of us are wanting to withdraw from the world.
Yes.
To get out of it. Why should I consider immersing myself in the world as a better path?
Right. Well, the world is full of these distractions and titillations and immediate gratifications, but in the long run, none of those will satisfy. What we really need to do is to stop and face the things that we're afraid of, face the things that are painful, do the things that are hard. And when we do that, when we stop running, it's really fascinating how there's kind of like a relief that comes with that. It's like, okay, I'm not going to pretend I can outrun this thing. I'm going to actually look hard at this thing and dive deeply into it. And in doing that, we can qualitatively change that experience. I find that really fascinating and really, really important. So whether it's something you're afraid of or something you're bored by or something that irritates you, take another look at it, right? Don't distract yourself away from it. Really immerse yourself in it, and it will change its contours as you do, and it will become rich and interesting and a friend, a companion. I think that's really, really fundamental.
Is there one last thing that you would like to say to us that could help us live a balanced life in a world that there's so many things that we can become addicted to? How can we live the life that we truly want to live, a life that is free?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the church sounds amazing. I love the slogan, a church for people who don't go to church. That's a church that I would want to go to. What I'm trying to do is reframe our orientation on pain. We really have this idea that pain is dangerous and that we need to escape pain. But what I'm trying to get people to see is that pain and pleasure are relative. They work in relation to each other. So if you are unhappy or struggling or depressed or anxious, it will be your instinct to reach for something to instantly take that feeling away. But what you might try instead is to paradox yourself and instead do something in that moment that is more painful than the pain you are feeling now. And if you can make it an embodied or physically challenging or painful thing, even better, because we're so detached from our bodies. We're sort of these floating heads. And what you will do is you will actually, if you succeed in doing that, you will actually change your physiology and upregulate dopamine and other feel-good neurotransmitters. And you will be relieved of your suffering because you did something that was hard.
I love what you said to that one student who had told you they listened to music all the time, always something. And you said, turn it all off.
Right.
And just walk across the campus.
Yeah. And yes. And that's a great example of doing something hard, right? Because that's a hard thing now. We're so used to constantly being stimulated in some way that just to sit with silence, right? Or to walk instead of drive, or to allow ourselves to be bored for a period of time, it's really scary and anxiety provoking. But the more that we do that, the more comfortable we will get, the more we will reset reward pathways. And then you talk about freedom. There's an amazing sense of peace and freedom that comes with that. But we have to do the experiments. So I urge, your congregation, try the experiments, do things that are intentionally hard, put away the things that feel good in the moment, do it for long enough to reset reward pathways, and then see how you feel.
That's great. It reminds me of that verse, be still and know that I am God. We have so much noise. It's hard to do that. And I don't recall you writing this in the book, but I've watched you on a bunch of YouTube videos now at this point doing interviews. And you had said something that I'm asked all the time, particularly by young professionals. I'm looking for my passion. And you said in an interview, stop looking for your passion and just look at what needs to get done.
Right.
That's brilliant.
Well, I think this is part of, the myth that we're telling young people now is that they have to aspire to some sort of grandiose achievement. And the way that they'll get there is by figuring out what their unique, grandiose contribution will be that will light up their life for the rest of time. And when you really look at, how people are contributing to a better world, it's in many, many small, mundane ways where they're just looking around them and seeing what needs to be done. That is what I really recommend, because by leapfrogging that step, people are ending up not in a good place and potentially not contributing in any meaningful way. Also, I just want to emphasize again that if you dive deeply enough into anything, you can make it interesting. You can make it compelling. You can make it worth doing.
Well, this has been great. Again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for writing this book. It's a difference maker. It's been a difference maker for me. And like I said, it's really helped me to understand the Bible better. So I am greatly appreciative of that. We have bought a whole bunch of your books, Dopamine Nation, and are going to be giving them out as gifts at church. So thank you for that. And thank you for your time. And also lastly, just thank you for your heart. I can tell that you want to make a difference, a positive difference in people's lives. And you mentioned a minute ago about grandstanding, and I can just tell that's not something that appeals to you. And that's really refreshing and wonderful. So we appreciate that.
Well, I'm very honored and very moved, and thank you for this.
Okay.